Blood smells like copper, but impending violence smells like ozone and cold sweat. Nora knew both intimately. Reaching up to straighten Dominic's silk tie, her knuckles brushed the steady pulse at his throat. He smelled of bergamot and bitter espresso. Over his shoulder, through the glass double doors, she saw the driver. His jacket hung wrong. A heavy metallic bulk ruined the bespoke lines. Nora smoothed the silk. "Your driver has a gun," she whispered. "Don't get in the car." Lemon oil and beeswax. That was the scent of survival. Nora rubbed the microfiber cloth in punishing concentric circles against the mahogany console table in the foyer. The wood was already immaculate, a dark mirror reflecting the cut crystal chandelier overhead, but stillness in this house was a liability. If you were standing still, you were listening. If you were listening, you were a threat. So Nora kept her hands moving. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split at the cuticles from harsh detergents, stinging mildly every time she flexed her fingers. It was a grounding pain. It kept her awake. Morning in the Rossi estate was a sterile, muted affair. The walls were thick, the carpets were plush enough to swallow the sound of a falling body. Nora had worked here for 11 months, long enough to understand the architecture of power and the geometry of keeping her head down. She was a maid, a ghost in a grey uniform with white trim. She collected a cash envelope every Friday and deposited it straight into a checking account that was slowly, agonizingly, building toward a one-way ticket out of the state. Footsteps sounded on the grand staircase. Not the hurried, heavy thud of the muscle that guarded the perimeter, but a measured, rhythmic click of leather on marble. Dominic. Nora didn't look up immediately. She shifted to the side of the hall, bowing her head, slightly blending into the damask wallpaper. He descended into the foyer, bringing with him a displacement of air that felt physically heavy. Dominic Rossi was not the hulking, scarred brute of cheap movies. He was lean-built with the wiry, coiled tension of a greyhound. Today he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nora's annual rent. But as he stepped off the final stair and into the natural light spilling from the frosted front doors, Nora caught the fraying edges of his immaculate facade. His jaw was clamped tight. The faint, purple smudges beneath his dark eyes betrayed nights spent staring at ceilings, calculating betrayals. He stopped by the mirror above the console table. He didn't look at his reflection. He just stared through the glass, his mind miles away, likely dissecting supply chains or ordering someone's quiet disappearance. Nora stood near the coat rack, holding his wool overcoat over her forearms. It was her job to hand it to him, open the door, and fade away. But something was wrong. Dominic's tie, a heavy woven midnight blue silk, was askew. The knot was pulled slightly to the left, the collar of his crisp white shirt pinching awkwardly. It was a microscopic error. For anyone else, nothing. For Dominic Rossi, a man who controlled his environment with a terrifying, obsessive precision, it was a glaring siren. He was distracted, dangerously so. Nora took a step forward. Her sensible rubber-soled shoes made a quiet squeak on the marble. Dominic's eyes snapped to her in the mirror. Cold. Empty. A predator registering movement. She didn't freeze. Freezing was what prey did. Instead, she kept her posture neutral, her eyes focused on his collar, completely ignoring the lethal weight of his stare. She closed the distance. "Your tie, sir," she murmured, her voice stripped of any inflection. He didn't say yes, but he didn't step back. That was permission. Nora raised her hands. The silk was cool under her rough fingertips. As she adjusted the knot, sliding it precisely to the center of his throat, the back of her knuckles grazed his skin. He was burning up. A feverish heat radiated from his neck. She smelled the sharp, clean citrus of his cologne, but beneath it lay the bitter, acrid tang of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated stress. He was a man holding a crumbling empire together with his bare hands. As she smoothed the lapels of his suit, her eyes inadvertently flicked past his shoulder. Through the large, reinforced glass panes of the front doors, the circular driveway came into view. The black armored sedan was idling. Small plumes of white exhaust vanished into the crisp morning air. Arthur, the morning driver, was standing by the rear passenger door. Nora had served Arthur coffee a dozen times. He was a thickly built man who usually slouched against the fenders, scrolling on his phone, bored out of his mind. Today Arthur wasn't slouching. He was standing rigidly straight. His left hand was entirely out of view, tucked behind his back. But it was his right side that caught Nora's hyper-vigilant attention. The right side of Arthur's suit jacket hung awkwardly. It didn't drape. It bulged, pulling the fabric taut across his ribs. The weight was dragging the hem down. It was the unmistakable jagged silhouette of a suppressed firearm tucked into a shoulder holster, sitting far higher and bulkier than the standard issue pieces the estate guards carried. Furthermore, Arthur was sweating. A thin sheen of moisture caught the morning sun on his forehead. It was 40 degrees outside. Arthur's eyes kept darting to the front door, not looking for his boss, looking at the glass, waiting for a target. Nora's hands were still on Dominic's chest. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a violent, panicked bird in a cage. If Dominic walked out that door, Arthur would pull the gun. There would be shouting, blood, retaliation. The estate would go on lockdown. Nobody would leave. Nobody would get paid. The fragile, quiet life she had carved out in the shadows of this criminal enterprise would detonate. She didn't care about Dominic Rossi. She cared about her Friday envelope. She cared about the quiet. Nora kept her face perfectly blank. She gave the silk tie one final decisive tug. She leaned in just a fraction of an inch, her mouth hovering near the lapel of his suit. "Your driver has a gun," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. "Don't get in the car." Dominic didn't flinch. That was the most terrifying part. A normal man would have jerked back. He would have looked over his shoulder. He would have gasped or demanded to know what she was talking about. Dominic did absolutely nothing. His breathing didn't hitch. His eyes, fixed entirely on Nora's pale face, didn't widen. If anything, the cold, ambient temperature of his gaze dropped several degrees. For 2 agonizing seconds, the silence in the foyer pressed against Nora's eardrums. Her hands were still resting lightly against his chest. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thumping of his heart. It hadn't sped up. It was maddeningly calm. Then his hand came up. His fingers closed around Nora's wrist. His grip was a steel vise, entirely disproportionate to the casual elegance of his suit. The pressure was immediate bruising, grinding her delicate bones together. A sharp gasp escaped her lips before she could bite it back. "You missed a spot," Dominic said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, pitched perfectly for normal conversation. It was casual, bored even. He didn't look at the door. He didn't look at Arthur. Dominic pivoted smoothly, using his grip on her wrist to pull her with him. He was dragging her away from the glass doors, back toward the interior of the house, turning his body so that Nora was positioned between him and the outside world. A human shield, she realized with a sickening jolt of adrenaline. If Arthur panicked and shot through the glass right now, the bullets would hit her spine first. "Sir, my arm." She gritted out, stumbling over the hem of her long uniform skirt to keep up with his long, unhurried strides. "Quiet," he murmured the word, carrying the lethal finality of a guillotine dropping. He pulled her down the hallway, past the dining room, toward the heavy, floor-to-ceiling oak doors of his private study. A room Nora was only allowed to clean on Tuesdays under the supervision of a guard. Today was Thursday. Dominic reached out, twisted the brass handle, and shoved the door open. He pulled Nora inside and kicked the door shut behind them. The heavy click of the reinforced lock engaging sounded like a vault ceiling. The study was dark, smelling of old paper-leather bindings and a faint trace of cigar smoke. Heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight over the windows. The moment the latch clicked, the facade evaporated. Dominic dropped her wrist. Nora stumbled backward, rubbing the blossoming red marks on her skin, her breath coming in short, harsh pants. Before she could process the transition, Dominic was moving. He didn't look tired anymore. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a terrifying kinetic violence. He crossed the room in 3 strides, reaching beneath the heavy mahogany desk. There was a metallic scrape, followed by the heavy, oily clack-clack of a slide being racked. When he stood back up, he was holding a black, blocky handgun. He didn't point it at her, keeping the barrel angled toward the Persian rug, but his posture was coiled tight. "Talk," he ordered. The bored baritone was gone. This voice was a serrated blade. Nora swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Arthur. The driver. I know his name." Dominic snapped his eyes, scanning the monitors on his desk that displayed the estate's security feeds. "What did you see?" "His right side," Nora said, forcing her voice to stay level. Panic would get her killed in this room. Facts were currency. "His jacket is pulling on the right. Heavy. It's a shoulder rig, but it's sitting too high. He's sweating. And he's not looking around the perimeter like he usually does. He's staring strictly at the front door." Dominic's dark eyes finally left the monitors and locked onto her. He studied her face, dissecting her expression, looking for the lie, the setup, the trap. "You noticed the drape of a jacket from 40 feet away through glare-proof glass." "I notice when things are out of place." "Sir," Nora said defensively, "that's what you pay me for. Dust out of place, chairs out of place, guns out of place. And you decided to warn me." He tilted his head, a gesture of dark curiosity. "Why?" Nora looked at the gun in his hand, then back up to his eyes. She wasn't going to feed him some sycophantic lie about loyalty. He would smell it, and he would punish it. "Because if you die on the front steps, the house goes into lockdown," Nora said, her voice dropping into a cynical, exhausted flatline. "The feds come, the rivals come, the accounts get frozen. I have rent due next week, Mr. Rossi, and I don't want to scrub your blood out of the marble. It stains." For a fraction of a second, the corner of Dominic's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the physical acknowledgement of brutal honesty. He tapped a key on his keyboard. The center monitor expanded to show the front driveway. Arthur was still there. Now he was pacing a tight, agitated circle near the hood of the car. He pulled out a phone, typed something frantically, and shoved it back into his pocket. "He's panicking," Dominic observed quietly, more to himself than to her. "The schedule said I walk out at precisely 8:15. It is 8:17. He set the gun down on the desk with a heavy thud. He picked up a sleek, encrypted landline phone and dialed a single digit. "Vinny," Dominic said into the receiver. His eyes remained locked on the monitor, watching Arthur. "Arthur is compromised. He's waiting by the car. Take him alive if you can. If he twitches toward his coat, put him in the gravel." He hung up the phone without waiting for a response. Nora stood frozen near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron to hide their shaking. Can I go back to cleaning now, sir?" Dominic turned to look at her. The shadows of the study clung to the sharp angles of his face. He looked at her, as if seeing her for the very first time, not as a piece of furniture, but as a living, breathing variable he hadn't accounted for. "No," Dominic said softly. He gestured to a leather armchair in the corner of the room. "You're going to sit down, Nora, because whoever paid Arthur knows the layout of my house, and until I figure out who it is, you are the only person in this building I know for an absolute fact isn't trying to kill me today." The oxblood leather of the armchair was buttery and cold. Nora sank into it, her spine rigid against the tufted back. The cushions exhaled a faint breath of cedar and old cigars as they took her weight. She gripped the armrests. Her fingernails dug into the seams. Her body was experiencing the inevitable brutal crash that followed an adrenaline spike. Her knees felt entirely liquid, and a sharp, metallic ringing vibrated behind her eardrums. She focused on the room. It was a survival tactic she had learned long before she ever set foot in the Rossi estate, when the world became dangerous catalogue the inanimate. There were 4 bookshelves, floor to ceiling, packed with heavy volumes. The desk was mahogany vast and imposing, free of paper clutter. 3 glowing monitors dominated its surface. Beside them sat the black handgun. It looked incredibly heavy. It looked loud. Dominic stood perfectly still behind the desk, his eyes locked on the center screen. He didn't pace. He didn't swear. The frantic, messy panic that accompanied violence in the real world was entirely absent in him. He was a machine, processing a glitch in its code. On the screen, the silent movie of the driveway played out. Nora couldn't look away, though her stomach churned with a slow, acidic rolling. A silver SUV had pulled up behind the idling armored sedan, blocking its exit. 2 men stepped out. One was Vinny, a man Nora recognized by his rolling, heavy-shouldered gait. He always asked for 2 sugars in his coffee. The other was a guard she didn't know. Arthur realized his trap had closed. The driver's posture on the screen went rigid. His hand darted toward the awkward bulge beneath his suit jacket. He never made it. Vinny moved with a terrifying, practiced economy. There was no grand struggle, no dramatic choreography. Vinny simply closed the distance, grabbed Arthur's drawing arm, twisted it violently backward, and drove a knee into the driver's ribs. The second guard hit Arthur from the side. The 3 men collapsed into a tangled heap on the immaculate, crushed gravel. Through the thick, soundproofed walls of the study, Nora heard absolutely nothing. The silence made the violence on the screen feel disconnected, almost surgical. Within 10 seconds, Arthur was hoisted back to his feet. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. His nose was bleeding a bright red smear on the grayscale security feed. Vinny patted down Arthur's chest, extracted the heavy firearm, and shoved it into his own waistband. They dragged the driver toward the side entrance of the estate, disappearing from the camera's view. Dominic finally exhaled. It was a long, slow release of breath through his nose. He reached out and tapped the keyboard, switching the main feed from the driveway to the subterranean garage. "They have him," Dominic said. He didn't turn around. He was speaking to the room, or perhaps just to the quiet, terrifying reality he occupied. "I have a mop bucket in the upstairs hallway," Nora blurted out. The words bypassed her brain entirely. It was a stupid, mundane thing to say, born of sheer nervous overload. Her voice cracked, sounding thin and brittle in the heavy air of the study. Dominic turned his head slowly. The ambient blue light from the monitors caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the dark, hollow exhaustion beneath his eyes. He looked at her, as if she had just spoken in tongues. "A mop bucket." He repeated, his tone completely flat. "Yes," Nora said, forcing her hands to uncurl from the armrests, wiping her sweating palms on her white apron. "I left it full of hot water and pine cleaner. It's going to ruin the hardwood if it sits too long, and Mrs. Gable will dock my pay. Mrs. Gable was the head housekeeper, a woman with eyes like a hawk and a soul made of sandpaper. Dominic stared at her. The contrast between the life-and-death assassination plot he was currently untangling and her desperate concern for a damp floor seemed to short-circuit something in his expression. For a fleeting second, the terrifying mob boss fractured, revealing a man who was simply profoundly baffled. "Someone just tried to blow my head off on my front steps," Dominic said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "And you are worried about the finish on the oak floors. You pay people to worry about your head, sir." Nora shot back, her tone clipped. The fear was morphing into a cynical protective exhaustion. "You pay me to worry about the floors." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He just turned his entire body toward her, leaning his weight against the edge of the mahogany desk. He crossed his arms over his chest, the ruined silk tie hanging loosely against his white shirt. "Who are you?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was a demand for structural schematics. "Nora Vance," she said, reciting the name on her fake ID with practiced ease. "I clock in at 5. I clock out at 3. I don't break the china." Nora Vance noticed a 1/4-inch drop in the hemline of a bespoke suit jacket from across a foyer. Dominic countered his dark eyes, stripping away her grey uniform, searching for the wiring underneath. Nora Vance knew a suppressed weapon sat higher in a shoulder rig than a standard Glock. Nora Vance didn't scream when she felt a gun underneath a man's coat. "Where did you learn to look for those things, Nora?" "You learn what bites," Nora said quietly, looking down at her scuffed rubber shoes. "And you learn to look for it before it gets close enough to use its teeth." Dominic let the silence stretch. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked a muffled rhythmic thrum through the heavy doors. He was weighing her answer, testing it for hollow spaces. Before he could dig deeper, the landline on his desk buzzed. A harsh electric snare drum. Dominic picked up the receiver. He didn't say hello. He just listened. "Put him on the floor," Dominic ordered the phone. "Patch the audio to my console." He hung up. He pressed a button on the base of his monitor stand. The muted silence of the study was instantly shattered by the crackle of static, followed by the heavy wet sound of a man coughing up blood. The audio feed was high fidelity. Too high. Nora could hear the subtle tearing sound of Arthur inhaling through a broken nose. She could hear the squeak of Vinnie's rubber-soled boots on the concrete floor of the garage. Dominic remained leaning against the desk. He didn't look at the monitor anymore. He looked directly at Nora. He was watching her endure it. "Mr. Rossi." Vinnie's voice came through the desktop speakers, slightly distorted and out of breath. "He's stubborn. Says he doesn't know who transferred the money. Just a dead drop in the city." "He's lying," Dominic said to the empty room. He leaned over and pressed a silver button on a small rectangular microphone beside his keyboard. "Break his left hand, Vinnie. The one he steers with. Then ask him again." Nora flinched. It was involuntary. Her shoulders jerked upward, her chin tucking down as if she could hide inside her own collarbone. Through the speakers there was a brief, breathless pause. Then a sharp, sickening crack. It sounded exactly like a thick branch snapping under a heavy boot. Arthur screamed. It wasn't a cinematic yell. It was a high, ragged, guttural sound that tore at the back of his throat, ending in a messy, choking sob. The smell of old paper and leather in the study suddenly felt suffocating. Nora's mouth flooded with bitter saliva. She squeezed her eyes shut. She forced herself to picture the mop bucket upstairs, the steam rising from the yellow liquid. the repetitive numbing motion of dragging the cotton strings across the grain of the wood. Left, right, left, right. "Dominic, please," Arthur begged through the static, his voice a wet, garbled mess. "It was encrypted, I swear to God. They threatened my sister. They showed me pictures of her apartment." Dominic's finger hovered over the microphone button. His face was a mask of carved marble. There was no pity. There was no anger either. It was pure, terrifying administration. "Everyone has a sister, Arthur," Dominic said into the mic, his voice smooth and dead. "Everyone has an excuse. You took my money for 3 years to keep me breathing, and today you took someone else's to stop my heart. Vinny, the right hand now." "No, wait! Wait!" Arthur shrieked, the panic making his voice crack. "It was the port, the south terminal, the shipment coming in on Tuesday. They said if you died today, the customs inspectors would be rerouted. That's all I know. That's all I swear." Dominic took his finger off the button. The garage fell into a heavy, gasping silence. Nora opened her eyes. She was breathing through her mouth, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid hitches. She realized she had dug her fingernails so hard into the leather armrests that her cuticles were bleeding again. Dominic was still watching her. He reached out and snapped a switch. The speakers popped, and the room was plunged back into that suffocating heavy silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock returned. "You didn't cover your ears?" Dominic observed quietly. Nora swallowed the bile at the back of her throat. She unclenched her hands, laying them flat on her lap, hiding the tiny beads of blood. "It doesn't stop happening just because I don't listen, Mr. Rossi." "Most people prefer the illusion," he said, pushing himself off the desk. He walked slowly toward her. The predatory grace was back in his movements. "Most people would be screaming right now, threatening to call the police, begging me to let them go." He stopped 2 feet from her chair. He was too tall. He took up too much oxygen. "I'm not most people," Nora said, her voice shaking slightly, betraying the stone-cold facade she was trying to maintain. "The police won't help me. Begging you is a waste of saliva. You'll let me go when you've decided I'm not a liability." Dominic tilted his head. He reached out. Nora went entirely rigid, bracing for the strike for the grip on her throat. Instead, his long, warm fingers gently brushed against the lapel of her grey uniform. He plucked a tiny, invisible piece of lint from the fabric. It was a mockery of the gesture she had performed on his tie just 20 minutes ago. "You're very practical, Nora," he murmured, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated in the hollow of her chest. It wasn't seductive. It was an acknowledgement of a shared, damaged frequency. Practical people survive, but practical people are also very easy to buy. How do I know whoever bought Arthur didn't buy you to be the backup? Nora looked up. She met his dark, exhausted eyes. She didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw a man who couldn't sleep because the entire world was trying to kill him. And suddenly she wasn't just terrified, she was angry. "Because if they had bought me," Nora said, her voice dropping into a harsh, cynical whisper, "I would have let you walk out the damn door. I would have let Arthur put a bullet in your chest, and I would be on a bus to Ohio right now." She leaned forward slightly, breaking the safety of the chair's distance. "I saved your life because your blood would ruin my routine." She spat. "And I cannot afford to lose this job. Don't flatter yourself into thinking it was anything else." For a long, suspended moment, Dominic Rossi just stared at her. The air between them crackled with a strange, hostile electricity. Then Dominic did something that chilled Nora to the marrow of her bones. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was a sharp, brilliant, terrible thing that transformed his face from a cold statue into a lethal, waking predator. It was the smile of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by liars who had just been handed a jagged, bleeding piece of the truth. Ohio, Dominic repeated softly, savouring the mundane word like fine wine. Not any more, Nora. He turned his back on her, walking back to his desk. You're off baseboard duty. You belong to me now. Vinny's knuckles were swollen. That was the first thing Nora noticed when he pushed the heavy guest room door open. The skin across his right hand was split and purple, leaking a sluggish bead of dark blood onto a thick gold pinky ring. He didn't seem to care, or maybe the adrenaline was still masking the throb. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the velvet armchair situated by the massive bay window. Sit, Vinny grunted. His breathing was still slightly laboured from the garage. Boss says you stay here. Don't touch the phone. Don't open the door. Nora didn't argue. She walked over to the chair and sank into it. The velvet was plush, swallowing her weight, a stark contrast to the hard wooden stools in the servants' break room. Vinny pulled the door shut. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic thunk. She was a prisoner. Upgraded from the baseboards to the guest wing, but a prisoner all the same. Nora rubbed her palms against her thighs, feeling the rough, cheap cotton of her grey uniform skirt. The fabric was damp where her sweaty hands had been resting for the past hour. Her mind raced a frantic rat in a maze, looking for the exit. There was no exit. The estate was locked down. She had seen the security monitors. The perimeter gates were sealed, and armed men were patrolling the tree line. If she tried to slip out the kitchen service door, she'd be shot as a hostile before she made it past the rose bushes. Time warped. The sun shifted across the Persian rug, turning the dust motes into lazy floating sparks. Her stomach gave a hollow, aggressive growl. She had skipped breakfast to scrub the foyer. That felt like a decade ago. The lock clicked. Nora flinched her shoulders, jumping up toward her ears. It wasn't Vinny this time. It was Mrs. Gable. The head housekeeper looked entirely out of place, standing in the doorway of a VIP suite, holding a stack of folded clothes. Her face was pinched, her lips a thin, bloodless line of sheer disapproval. "Take off the uniform," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was brittle, lacking its usual commanding bark. She dropped the clothes onto the edge of the king-sized bed. "Mr. Rossi's orders. You aren't on my payroll anymore." Nora stood up. She looked at the clothes, then at the older woman. "Mrs. Gable, Don't speak to me." The housekeeper snapped her eyes, darting nervously down the hallway, before returning to Nora. "You made your bed. Whatever game you're playing with him, it ends badly for girls like you. Put the clothes on. He's waiting." Mrs. Gable walked out, pulling the door shut, but leaving it unlocked. Nora walked over to the bed. Her hands were shaking again. She reached out and touched the fabric. It wasn't some ridiculous silken mob wife dress. It was purely functional. A pair of thick, dark denim jeans. A black cashmere turtleneck that felt sinfully soft against her calloused fingertips. A heavy wool peacoat. Beside the clothes sat a pair of black leather boots. She stripped off the grey uniform. Letting it drop to the floor felt like shedding a layer of armour. The uniform made her invisible. These clothes made her a participant. She pulled the turtleneck over her head, the cashmere warming her chilled skin instantly. She laced up the boots. They fit perfectly. Dominic hadn't asked her size. He just knew, or he paid someone who made it their business to know everything. When she stepped out into the hallway, Dominic was leaning against the wall near the staircase. He had changed his shirt. The ruined midnight blue tie was gone, replaced by an open collar. He held a thick file folder under one arm. He looked her up and down. His gaze was entirely clinical, assessing her the way he would assess a new piece of hardware. "They fit," he noted, pushing off the wall. "Good. Walk." Nora fell into step beside him as they descended the grand staircase. "Walk where?" "South Terminal." Dominic replied, his voice clipped. "Arthur sang about a shipment. The customs inspectors are compromised. We are going to uncompromise them." Nora stopped on the landing. "I'm not going to a port. I don't shoot people. I don't interrogate people. I clean floors." Dominic stopped a few steps below her. He turned slowly, looking up at her from the shadows of the foyer. The ambient light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "I have 50 men who can shoot." Dominic said, his tone devoid of any patience. "I have Vinny to break bones. I don't need another gun, Nora. I need someone who sees a 1/4-inch drop in a hemline from 40 feet away. My men look for threats they understand. They look for guns. They look for rival colors. I need someone who looks for dust out of place." "I could get killed," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If bullets start flying, I don't know how to duck." "Then stand behind me," Dominic said simply. It wasn't a boast. It was a terrifying statement of fact. He turned around and continued walking toward the front doors. Nora stood on the marble stairs for 3 long seconds. The silence of the house pressed against her spine. She cursed under her breath, a bitter, venomous sound, and hurried down the stairs to follow him into the cold. The smell hit her before the SUV even came to a complete stop. It was a heavy, suffocating mixture of diesel exhaust or rotting kelp and raw, freezing salt water. The South Terminal port was a sprawling industrial nightmare of rust and groaning metal. Towering cranes loomed against the grey afternoon sky like skeletal birds of prey, plucking shipping containers from the bellies of massive freighters. Nora sat in the back of the armored vehicle, her fingers digging into the plush leather of the seat. The heater was blasting, but she couldn't stop shivering. It wasn't the cold. It was the crushing weight of the environment. There were no baseboards here, no polished marble, just thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast. Dominic sat beside her. He hadn't spoken since they left the estate. He was typing methodically on a secure tablet, the pale blue light illuminating the exhaustion permanently etched around his eyes. Vinny put the SUV in park behind a stack of rusted corrugated containers. He killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the cabin was immediately replaced by the muffled rhythmic thud of heavy machinery outside. "We walk from here," Dominic said, tossing the tablet onto the seat. He pushed his door open. The freezing wind immediately ripped into the cabin. Nora gasped the air, feeling like broken glass in her lungs. She scrambled out, pulling the heavy wool peacoat tight against her chest. Vinny and 3 other guards fanned out their hands, hovering casually near their waistbands. They moved with a predatory looseness. Dominic walked in the center, his long overcoat flapping in the wind. He didn't look back to see if Nora was following. He expected it. She hurried to keep up her new leather boots, crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. She hated the noise. She hated being exposed. They wove through the labyrinth of shipping containers. The deeper they went, the darker it got, the towering steel walls blocking out the pale winter sun. It smelled strongly of machine oil and wet iron. "Container 884, Bravo," Dominic said, quietly, not breaking his stride. "Electronics from overseas. At least that's what the manifest says. If Arthur was telling the truth, the men guarding this aisle aren't mine." Nora's heart slammed against her ribs. "What do you want me to do?" "Just look," Dominic commanded. "Don't stare. Sweep your eyes. Tell me what doesn't belong." They turned a sharp corner stepping into a wide alleyway between 2 rows of stacked containers. At the far end, about 60 yards away, a group of 4 men stood in high-visibility yellow vests. They were gathered around a folding table holding thermoses of coffee and clipboards. A large forklift idled nearby. "Keep walking." "Normal pace," Vinny muttered from his position, just behind Nora's left shoulder. Nora forced her legs to move naturally, though her knees felt like water. She looked at the group of men. They looked entirely ordinary. Dock workers freezing their asses off on a Tuesday afternoon. They were laughing their breath, pluming in white clouds in the frigid air. "I don't see anything," Nora whispered, panic beginning to squeeze her throat. "They're just guys in vests." "Look harder," Dominic murmured. The warmth of his body radiated against her side as they walked. It was the only source of heat in the freezing alley. "Stop looking at the vests. Look at the dirt." Nora swallowed hard. She forced her eyes away from the bright yellow fabric. She looked at the men's boots, scuffed, muddy, coated in a fine layer of grey salt from the docks. She looked at the table, coffee cups, a crushed pack of cigarettes. Then she saw it. The man standing on the far right. He was holding a clipboard, laughing at a joke the man next to him was making. "The one on the right." Nora breathed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What about him?" Dominic asked, his tone perfectly flat, his eyes fixed dead ahead. "He's holding a clipboard with his left hand," Nora said, her eyes tracking the man's subtle movements. "But he's right-handed. He just reached for his coffee cup with his right hand, but stopped halfway and used his left." "Maybe he's ambidextrous," Vinny grunted skeptically. "No." Nora insisted, her instincts taking over the cynical Maid, replacing the terrified hostage. "Look at his right hand. It's jammed deep into his jacket pocket. He hasn't taken it out once. Even when he laughed and leaned back, his body stayed rigid on that side. He's anchoring something heavy." Dominic slowed his pace by a fraction of a second. "What else?" "His hard hat." Nora continued the details, snapping into focus with terrifying clarity. "The other 3 men have scratches and dents on their helmets. Greasy fingerprints on the brims. His is immaculate. It's straight out of the plastic wrap. He's never done a day of manual labor in his life." Dominic stopped walking. He was still 30 yards away from the men. The laughter at the folding table died. The 4 men looked up. The illusion of a casual coffee break shattered instantly. The air in the alleyway tightened, growing thick and electric. The man on the right, the one with the clean, hard hat, began to pull his right hand out of his jacket pocket. "Get down," Dominic said. He didn't shout. He didn't push her. He simply stepped completely in front of Nora, his broad shoulders eclipsing her view of the table, turning himself into a solid, unmoving wall between her and the threat. The harsh, deafening crack of gunfire tore through the alley, echoing violently off the steel containers. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a physical blow, a sudden violent displacement of air that punched Nora squarely in the sternum. Before her brain could process the noise, gravity vanished. Dominic's hand hit the back of her neck, a heavy, brutal pressure that drove her straight down into the freezing, oil-slicked gravel. Her knees struck the ground, hard enough to send a sickening jar up her spine, tearing the thick denim of her new jeans. The wet cold of the winter slush immediately soaked through to her skin. She hit the dirt, tucking her chin, curling into a tight, desperate ball. Above her, the world simply tore itself apart. The gunfire wasn't rhythmic or dramatic. It was a chaotic, deafening staccato of mechanical violence that made the steel shipping containers vibrate. Hot, sharp pieces of brass casing rained down around her, one searing the back of her hand through the cashmere sleeve. She didn't scream. She clamped her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes so tightly that white spots exploded in the darkness behind her eyelids. The smell of the port salt and rotting kelp was instantly eradicated by the sharp metallic stench of burning cordite and vaporized copper. It coated her tongue. It burned the back of her throat. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then, the terrible ringing silence rushed back in, broken only by the low groaning hum of the idling forklift and the crunch of Vinny's heavy boots moving rapidly across the gravel. "Clear," Vinny grunted. His voice sounded thin and distant through the high-pitched whine trapped in Nora's eardrums. The heavy weight of Dominic's arm lifted from her back. He had stayed over her the entire time, pressing her into the dirt, offering his own wool-clad back to the alleyway. Nora gasped, sucking in freezing gunpowder-laced air. Her lungs burned. She tried to push herself up, but her hands slipped on the greasy mud. A strong hand wrapped around her bicep, hauling her upright with effortless, terrifying strength. Dominic's face was inches from hers. The calculated cold administrator was gone. His pupils were dilated, swallowing the dark brown of his irises. A thin, angry line of red marked his cheekbone where a chip of ricocheted gravel had sliced him. A single drop of blood welled there stark against his pale, exhausted skin. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer comfort. He physically patted her down shoulders, ribs, hips, his hands moving with rapid clinical efficiency, searching for the wet stickiness of a gunshot wound. "I'm fine," Nora choked out, swatting his hand away from her waist. Her voice shook uncontrollably. "I'm fine. Don't touch me." Dominic stepped back, dropping his hands. The frantic energy in his chest settled, returning to that coiled, dangerous stillness. He turned his attention to the table. Nora forced herself to look. She couldn't afford to be blind. 3 of the dock workers were on their knees, their hands locked behind their heads, faces pale and slick with terror. The 4th man, the one with the clean, hard hat, was flat on his back in the slush. His high-visibility vest was ruined, soaked in a rapidly spreading pool of dark, steaming crimson. His right hand was entirely free of his pocket now. A heavy silver revolver lay in the dirt a few inches from his twitching fingers. Nora stared at the gun. If she hadn't noticed the hard hat, if she hadn't mentioned the left hand, that silver weapon would have been drawn while they were 30 yards closer. Dominic would be the one bleeding into the frozen mud. Her stomach lurched violently. She turned her head, bending over at the waist, and dry heaved. Nothing came up but bitter, acidic bile. Vinny crouched beside the dead man. He didn't check for a pulse. The glassy stare was confirmation enough. He drove his hands roughly into the man's pockets, pulling out a set of car keys, a half-empty pack of mints, and a sleek black smartphone. "Burner," Vinny said, tossing the phone to Dominic. Dominic caught it one-handed. He stared at the blank screen, his thumb tracing the cheap plastic casing. He looked at the 3 surviving dock workers. They were shaking so violently their teeth clicked. "Who paid him?" Dominic asked. The volume of his voice was low, but it carried perfectly over the wind. It was utterly devoid of human warmth. "We don't know," one of the men sobbed, a thick stream of snot running onto his moustache. "Swear on my kids, Mr. Rossi. He just showed up this morning. Said he was a transfer from the North Terminal. Had the Union card and everything. We just thought he was the new guy." Dominic stared at the man for a long, agonizing moment. He was reading the terror, measuring it against his own internal lie detector. Finally he nodded. "Get out of here," Dominic said. "Take the rest of the week. If anyone asks, a container dropped." The 3 men scrambled to their feet, slipping in the mud, and sprinted blindly toward the main thoroughfare of the port. Dominic looked down at the burner phone, then slipped it into his overcoat pocket. He turned back to Nora. She was standing, hugging herself, her teeth chattering loud enough to be heard over the wind. The cold was finally piercing the adrenaline. The damp knees of her jeans were freezing against her skin. Dominic shrugged out of his heavy wool peacoat. He stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, holding the furnace-like heat of his body. It smelled intensely of bergamot stale coffee and the sharp metallic tang of burnt powder. "Walk," he said gently, turning her by the shoulder toward the SUV. "We're done here." The heat inside the armored SUV was suffocating, blasting from the vents with dry, aggressive force. Nora kept her face turned toward the reinforced glass of the window, watching the bleak industrial landscape of the port bleed into the grey concrete arteries of the city highway. She had Dominic's heavy coat pulled tightly around her, completely ruining the clean lines of her frame. She looked like a child drowning in borrowed armor. Nobody spoke. Vinny drove with 2 hands on the wheel, his eyes flicking constantly between the road and the rearview mirror. Beside her, Dominic sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. The thin cut on his cheekbone had stopped bleeding, leaving a dried, rust-colored streak across his skin. Nora looked down at her own hands. Her palms were scraped raw, embedded with tiny dark flecks of port gravel and oil. They stung with a steady, pulsing heat. They looked like the hands of someone who belonged in this violent, messy world. She hated them. The heavy iron gates of the Rossi estate parted flawlessly as they approached. Vinny didn't stop in the circular driveway. He bypassed the front doors, steering the heavy vehicle around to the subterranean garage. The same garage where Arthur's hand had been broken just hours before. The concrete floor was freshly pressure-washed. It smelled sharply of bleach. "Vinny, take the phone to the basement. Crack the encryption," Dominic ordered as he pushed his door open. "I want a name by midnight." "Yes, boss." Dominic didn't wait for Nora. He walked toward the private elevator that serviced the family quarters. Nora scrambled out of the SUV, her boots squeaking on the damp concrete, and hurried to catch the closing doors. She slipped in just as the steel panels slid shut. The elevator was a tight, mahogany-paneled box. The proximity was terrible. She could hear his breathing slow, measured, entirely controlled. "Where are we going?" Nora asked, her voice raspy. "Kitchen," he replied, not looking at her. The doors opened onto the second floor, revealing the sprawling industrial-grade private kitchen. It was a masterpiece of stainless steel white marble and absolute silence. The staff wasn't allowed on this floor without an explicit summons. Dominic walked straight to a bank of deep drawers near the commercial sink. He pulled out a white plastic first aid kit, dropped it onto the cold marble island, and unclasped it. "Sit," he said, pointing to one of the high leather bar stools. Nora hesitated, the heavy coat slipping off one shoulder. "I can wash my own hands." "Sit down, Nora." It wasn't a request. She climbed onto the stool. Dominic walked around the island, stepping directly into her space. He reached out and took her left hand. His grip was firm but oddly careful, avoiding the raw, scraped meat of her palm. He pulled a bottle of iodine and a stack of square gauze pads from the kit. "This is going to burn," he stated matter-of-factly. He didn't wait for a nod. He tipped the brown liquid onto the gauze and pressed it directly into the center of her palm. Nora hissed a sharp intake of breath through her teeth. Her hand instinctively jerked, trying to pull away from the searing chemical fire, but his grip on her wrist tightened, locking her in place. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating register. He began to wipe the gravel and oil from her skin with methodical sweeping motions. She watched his face. He was entirely focused on the task, his dark eyes tracking the tiny bleeding abrasions. Up close, the exhaustion on his face was staggering. The faint purple bruises under his eyes looked permanent. He was a man slowly being crushed by the weight of his own architecture. "Why didn't you scream?" Dominic asked, suddenly, his eyes not leaving her hand. Nora swallowed. "At the port, when the shooting started." He tossed the dirty gauze onto the marble and picked up a fresh one, moving to her right hand. "Most people scream, they panic, they run blindly into the line of fire. You just dropped and made yourself as small as possible." "Screaming doesn't make the bullets stop," Nora said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It just tells them where you are." Dominic paused. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and interrogating. He was digging again, looking for the blueprint of her trauma. "Who taught you to hide like that, Nora?" he asked softly. Nora looked away, fixing her gaze on the stainless steel refrigerator. "My father. He wasn't a mob boss. He just liked to drink. And when he drank, he liked to throw heavy things. You learn quickly that standing up and yelling is a good way to catch a glass ashtray with your teeth." Dominic didn't offer a platitude. He didn't apologize for asking. He simply absorbed the data, slotting it into his understanding of the woman sitting in front of him. He finished cleaning her right hand, tossing the second gauze pad away. He pulled out a tube of antiseptic ointment and began carefully working it into her raw skin. His thumb smoothed over her bruised knuckles, the touch startlingly gentle for a man who had ordered a brutal torture session just hours ago. "You can't go back to the baseboards," Dominic said, his focus returning to her hands. "You know that, right? The men at the port saw you with me. The staff in this house knows you pulled me into the study before Arthur was taken. You are visibly in play." A cold, heavy dread settled in Nora's stomach. "I just want my paycheck, Mr. Rossi. I just want to be invisible." "Invisible is a luxury you can no longer afford," Dominic said, capping the ointment. He finally released her hands and stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. "You are valuable. And in my world, valuable things are either protected or they are stolen and broken by the competition." Nora looked down at her clean, stinging hands. The grey uniform was gone. The quiet, ghost-like existence she had fought so hard to build was dead on the floor of a freezing shipping port. She looked back up at Dominic. The cynicism flared in her chest, a protective, bitter shield against the terrifying reality of her new life. "So what am I now?" she asked, her voice hard. "A bodyguard who flinches? A maid who checks for assassins?" Dominic reached out his knuckles, lightly brushing the heavy wool lapel of the coat she was still wearing. It was a branding, a territorial marker. "You," Dominic said, his eyes darkening with a terrifying, absolute possessiveness, "are the only thing keeping me alive. And I protect my investments." Investment? The word hung in the sterile air of the kitchen. It smelled faintly of the iodine drying on her skin and the sharp chemical tang of the bleach used on the marble. Nora didn't blush. She didn't feel a sudden, cinematic flutter in her stomach. What she felt was the cold, heavy realization of a vault door locking from the outside. She pulled her hands back. The skin pulled tight over her bruised knuckles, stinging with a dull, throbbing heat. She let them drop to her lap, hiding them in the folds of his oversized peacoat. Dominic turned away. He walked to the massive stainless steel refrigerator. The compressor hummed a low, constant vibration Nora could feel in the roots of her teeth. He pulled out a glass pitcher and poured ice water into a heavy crystal tumbler. The ice cracked sharply, the sound violent in the quiet room. He drank it in one long, continuous swallow, his throat working rhythmically. He wasn't savoring it. He was hydrating a machine that had been running on dry fumes for too long. He set the glass down. It left a ring of condensation on the counter. "I sleep down the hall," Dominic said, wiping the back of his hand across his mouth. "The suite next to mine is empty. The windows are bullet-resistant glass. The door has a steel core. You will sleep there tonight." "And tomorrow?" Nora asked. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual defensive armor. The exhaustion was finally bleeding into her bones, making her limbs feel like lead. "Tomorrow I find out who bought my driver and my dock workers," Dominic replied. His back still turned to her. He braced his hands on the edge of the marble island. His head bowed the muscles in his back, tense beneath his shirt. "And then I dismantle them." He pushed off the counter and walked toward the archway that led to the private corridor. He didn't check to see if she was following. Nora slid off the leather bar stool. Her knees buckled slightly as her boots hit the floor, her quadriceps burning from the lingering tension of the port. She pulled his coat tighter around herself and followed him. The private corridor was entirely different from the rest of the house. There were no antique vases, no decorative tables. It was a wide, functional hallway, lined with thick carpet that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. The lighting was dim, recessed into the ceiling, casting long, bruised shadows against the walls. They reached a heavy mahogany door. Dominic pressed his thumb against a discreet biometric scanner set into the doorframe. The lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical thunk that vibrated in the floorboards. He pushed the door open, reaching inside to flick a switch. The suite was massive, decorated in muted greys and deep blues. A king-sized bed dominated the center of the room. But Nora didn't look at the silk sheets or the enormous fireplace. She looked at the lack of exits. There was one door. The windows were locked shut. It was a very beautiful, very expensive cage. "There are fresh clothes in the closet. The bathroom has whatever you need," Dominic said, standing in the doorway. He didn't step over the threshold. Before Nora could respond, the soft chime of the private elevator echoed down the hall. Dominic's posture changed instantly. The brief flicker of domestic stillness evaporated. His hand dropped automatically toward the waistband of his trousers, even though he had left his gun in the study. The elevator doors slid open. Vinny stepped out. The massive enforcer looked worse than he had in the garage. His suit jacket was off his shirt sleeves, rolled up to reveal thick, tattooed forearms. His knuckles were heavily wrapped in stark white medical tape. He held the burner phone in his uninjured left hand. Vinny walked down the hall, his heavy steps eating up the distance. He stopped 2 feet from Dominic. He didn't look at Nora standing inside the room. The encryption was cheap. Vinny grunted, his voice rough. Off-the-shelf software. The tech guys bypassed it in 20 minutes. "The name Vinny?" Dominic demanded softly. Vinny swallowed. It was the first time Nora had ever seen the man look hesitant. It wasn't the South Side crew boss. It wasn't the Russians either. "Give me the name." Vinny looked down at the phone. It was an internal transfer, routed through a shell company in the Caymans, but the origin IP bounced back to a server we own. The authorization code belonged to your uncle. The silence that followed was absolute. Nora watched Dominic's face. She expected anger. She expected him to smash the phone or yell. He did nothing. He just stared at Vinny. For a long, terrible moment, Dominic Rossi looked like a man who had been expecting a knife in the back for 10 years and was simply relieved it had finally arrived. "Uncle Sal," Dominic whispered. The name tasted like ash. "He's at the compound in Jersey," Vinny added quietly. "He requested an extra detail of guards this morning. Claimed he was worried about a retaliatory strike after your incident. Dominic nodded slowly. Assemble the men. Tell the armory to issue the heavy plates. We leave in 20 minutes. Boss, you just got shot at. You haven't slept in? 20 minutes, Vinny. The enforcer nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin, and turned back down the hall. Dominic stood in the doorway for a moment longer. He looked at the floor, processing the geometry of the coming war. Then he looked up at Nora. She was standing near the foot of the massive bed, still drowning in his coat. Her hair was messy, her face pale, her hands raw. She looked completely out of place, but she didn't look away. "Lock the door behind me," Dominic said. His voice was completely hollowed out. "You're going to kill your uncle," Nora stated. "It wasn't a question. I'm going to correct a structural failure," Dominic corrected softly. "If I don't, I am dead by Friday, and whoever comes to claim this house will not be kind to the people hiding in it." He reached out his hand, hovering near the door handle. "Don't die," Nora blurted out. The words bypassed her brain entirely. She hated herself the second they left her mouth. It sounded weak. It sounded like she cared. Dominic froze. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the dim light. He saw the cynical maid, the traumatized survivor, and the practical woman who just wanted her paycheck. And somewhere in that messy, complicated reality, he found something that anchored him. The corner of his mouth twitched a faint ghost of a smile. "I told you," Dominic murmured, the gravel returning to his voice. "I protect my investments." He pulled the heavy door shut. Nora stood in the quiet room. She listened to the mechanical thunk of the deadbolt sliding into place, sealing her inside. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of expensive laundry detergent, but underneath it, clinging to the wool of the coat, wrapped tightly around her shoulders, she could still smell the bitter tang of gunpowder and cold sweat. She walked over to the reinforced window and looked out at the dark, sprawling grounds of the estate. She was safe. She was terrified, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was never scrubbing a baseboard ever again.